Some places are abandoned for a reason. Some places hold secrets that refuse to be forgotten. And some places should never be entered. This story takes us back to 2021, during my time in college. I was pledging for a fraternity, and as part of our tradition, our entire pledge class took a trip to an abandoned asylum a few towns over. It was a rite of passage, one that none of us would ever forget. Daniel was my closest pledge brother that night. A few of us carpooled together and forested in a lot near a forest that bordered the asylum. We waited for everyone to arrive, then made our way down a narrow path. The further we walked, the darker it became. The path eventually cut right, forcing us into a dense patch of woods. I remember regretting my choice of footwear, white Air Force Ones, completely unsuitable for the damp ground beneath us. And then, through the trees, we saw it. A towering, lifeless building that once buzzed with life, now swallowed by darkness. A asylum left to decay, its windows shattered, its halls silent. It stood there like a tombstone, marking the resting place of something long forgotten. A few guys in our group had been here before. They knew the way in. We climbed through a broken window, stepping into what appeared to be a basement level. The floor was wet, sending a chill up my spine, not just from the cold, but from the unsettling feeling that we were not supposed to be there. We moved together, 10 of us, our footsteps echoing through the hollow corridors. Peeling paint, rusted gurneys, and shattered glass painted a picture of a place frozen in time. The deeper we went, the heavier the air felt. Alex, one of the guys who had explored the asylum before, explained that most people never thought to enter from the forest side, which is why this place remained relatively untouched. Unlike other abandoned buildings covered in graffiti and vandalized remains, this one felt preserved, almost like something or someone wanted it that way. As we ventured further, the group naturally split into smaller packs. Daniel and I took a separate corridor, stepping cautiously into what used to be a patient's room. The asylum bed remained, its sheets stained and crumpled. Old medical equipment stood in the corner, rusted and forgotten. And then, we heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, just outside the door. Our heads snapped toward the doorway as a shadow passed. A dark figure, moving silently. We barely caught a glimpse before it disappeared down the hall. "Did you see that?" I whispered. Daniel nodded. I stepped into the hallway, my heart pounding. At the end of the corridor, I saw it. A person, or at least, something shaped like one. They stood motionless, facing either me or the wall. I couldn't tell. The dim light barely revealed their outline. I called out, "Who's there?" No answer. Then, without a sound, they turned and slipped into the room beside them. "We need to go," I muttered. Daniel didn't argue. We turned back, quickening our pace, eager to reunite with the others. The sound of their voices grew nearer. Relief washed over me, but just as we were about to reach them, a scream, a blood-curdling, bone-chilling scream of a woman, tearing through the silence. It came from behind us, from the corridor we had just left. It was the kind of scream that made your skin crawl, the kind that didn't just sound like fear. It was fear, raw, agonizing, desperate. The voices of our friends had gone silent, or maybe the scream had drowned them out. "Run!" Daniel and I bolted. Panic took over. Our feet pounded against the floors as we ran toward the entrance. The others, sensing our terror, followed without hesitation. Down the stairs, past the empty halls, through the shadows that now seemed to be closing in. One by one, we scrambled through the broken window, each second feeling like an eternity. I was last. As I crawled through, I heard them. Footsteps. Not ours, not human. Heavy, deliberate, thundering down the stairs. I felt something behind me. I didn't dare look back. I hit the ground and ran. Through the woods, through the darkness, my breath ragged, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. When we reached the cars, we gasped for air, adrenaline still surging through our veins. That's when I told them. I saw someone in the corridor, right where the screams came from. Silence. We left without another word, the asylum looming behind us, its secrets still buried within its walls. And that night, I swore I'd never step foot in a place like that again. Some places are abandoned for a reason. Some places never let go of their past. And some places never let go of you. It was a quiet, foggy Saturday night. A 14-year-old boy sat on the couch, eyes glazed over at the TV, cartoons playing in the background. Wind howled against the window. His mother was upstairs, lost in her bedtime routine. Everything felt normal until the knock came. A sudden knock echoed through the house. It wasn't loud or desperate, just unexpected. At that hour, no one ever visited. Hesitant, he crept to the door and peeked through the peephole. Outside stood Mr. Lawson, an old friend of the family, his coat soaked from the mist. His face was grave. Something felt off. "Hey, kid, I need to speak to your mom. It's about your dad. He's in the hospital." Tires screeched against wet pavement as the car raced through the fog. The boy sat in the back seat, heart pounding. His mother fired off panicked questions, but Mr. Lawson's answers were short. The only thing that mattered, his father was in surgery. The hospital doors slid open. The harsh white lights contrasted sharply with the darkness outside. Hospitals always felt cold, sterile, too clean, but that night it felt different. Office. They sat in the waiting area. The clock ticked loudly. 2 a.m. Restless, the boy stood. "I'll just walk around a bit." The hallways were dimly lit and eerily silent. The further he walked, the stranger it felt. The walls seemed to stretch endlessly, twisting in ways they shouldn't. Then he felt it, a presence, someone behind him. At the end of the hallway stood a man, motionless, watching. The boy told himself it was his imagination until he looked again. The man was closer. His heart pounded. He picked up his pace. So did the man. Panic surged through him. He turned a corner, spotted a door slightly ajar, and slipped inside. The room was cold. Rows of metal drawers lined the walls. A slow realization dawned. This was the morgue. Then a knock, faint, from inside one of the drawers. His breath hitched. His skin crawled. Another knock, louder. His trembling hand reached for the handle. A voice startled him. "Hey, kid, what are you doing here?" The boy jumped, turning to see a doctor standing in the doorway, eyes filled with curiosity and suspicion. There was a knock," the boy stammered, pointing to the drawer. The doctor raised an eyebrow, stepping past him. He opened one drawer, then another. Each revealed cold, lifeless bodies. "See? Just the deceased." The boy barely had time to react before he heard it again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, outside the room. The door creaked open slightly. The shadowed figure stood there. He didn't wait. He ran, and the man followed. The boy's lungs burned as he turned corner after corner, the hallways looping back on themselves. No exit in sight. Then, "Charlie? Where are you?" His mother's voice rang through the air. Desperate, he sprinted toward it, tears streaming down his face. He burst into the waiting area, collapsing into her arms. Shaking, he turned back. The hallway was empty. The man was gone. Morning arrived. The doctor, the same one from the morgue, listened as the boy recounted his story. "A knock? From inside a morgue drawer? Kid, that's impossible." He didn't believe him. No one did. But the boy knew what he heard, what he saw. To this day, the knock still echoes in his mind, and sometimes he wonders if the man is still out there, watching, waiting. Some nightmares don't fade. Some doors should never be opened, and some knocks should never be answered. I've worked as a nurse in multiple hospitals and care facilities. Before the hospital I work at now, I worked at a long-term care center about an hour outside of Chicago. I had experience working with elderly patients before, so this wasn't new to me. I had been working there for only a few weeks. Soon you'll understand why that was. This happened on my second to last shift at that facility. At the time, I was working the overnight shifts, running on little to no sleep. That night, I was assigned to the dementia ward. The patients there seemed to like me, maybe because I was one of the younger nurses. I think in their fading minds, I was a small connection to reality. Most of the patients that night were quiet, but one was different. Her name was Margaret. This was my first night handling her care, and she kept telling me about the voices she heard and the tall man in the corner of her room, dressed in black. The other woman in her room had already asked for the curtain to be shut so Margaret would leave her alone. She was a sweet woman. She smiled at me when I entered, but didn't talk much and was very forgetful. Since I started my shift around 10 p.m., most of the patients were asleep by midnight, but not Margaret. Every time she called me into her room, she was shaking. She kept saying the voices were getting louder, that the tall man was standing there, watching her. I won't lie, it was starting to get to me. I didn't know what she was seeing, but I could tell that, in her mind, it was real. I tried to calm her down, reassure her, tell her that she wasn't alone. I didn't turn on the TV because I wanted to be courteous of her roommate. Instead, I held Margaret's hands and told her to breathe, to relax. I reminded her that I was just a call away. It seemed to work. The next time I checked in, she was asleep. Once most of the patients were sleeping, the night slowed down. Time moved strangely, like it wasn't passing at all. About an hour later, I was in the supply room, stocking my cart, when I heard something. The room was small. The door was closed. There shouldn't have been any other noises. I turned. Nothing. I went back to my cart. Then, I felt it. A hand, right on my shoulder. I turned my head so fast I nearly lost my balance. But there was nothing. No one. I peeked into the hallway. It was empty, quiet. Trying to ignore the growing unease in my stomach, I went back to my cart. I kept stalking it, moving faster than before. Then as I turned toward the door, I fell backward, my heart slamming into my throat. There was a man, tall, dressed in black. Standing outside the door, watching me, smiling, I screamed, loud enough to wake the whole ward. Then, he was gone. Seconds later, the door opened, and another nurse rushed in, helping me off the floor. I was still gasping for air when I asked, "Did you see him? The man in black?" Her expression made my stomach drop. "What man?" "There's no one here." We checked the rooms. We checked the hallways. Nothing. Then Margaret started screaming. When I rushed to her room, she was curled up in bed, shaking. "The voices! He's coming! He's coming!" I felt sick. I asked her, "Margaret, what did he look like? Was he smiling?" She looked at me, her face changing. For the first time all night, her expression was completely clear. She whispered, "How did you know?" My stomach turned. Then she started screaming again. The other nurses came in to calm her down. I was moved to a different ward that night, and by morning I knew I was done. I texted the head nurse that my next shift would be my last. I didn't want to set foot in that place again. I've never hallucinated before. I know exhaustion can play tricks on your mind, but this was something else. I don't know what Margaret was hearing. I don't know if I imagined what I saw. But I do know that the feeling of that hand on my shoulder, the man outside the door, it felt real. And I hope I never experience anything like it again.